In this lesson, we are going to talk about active learning. If you haven't yet already, please complete the 1-minute paper activity before moving on with the video. It only takes a minute. Go ahead, pause the video, we'll wait. What I would like to add about this activity is that when you have your students do it in a class, you don't have to have them share or hand in what they wrote. Sometimes students feel more comfortable free writing when they know no one's going to read it, so they don't have to worry about grammar or sentence structure. Or after students have taken a moment to write, you can ask 1 or 2 volunteers to share what they wrote. This is a great way to get a discussion going because everyone has just had a chance to think of something to say. Or sometimes I will have students share what they wrote anonymously by collecting their pieces of paper, randomly distributing them around the class, and then asking volunteers to read what they have just been handed. There are a lot of great ways to make use of the 1-minute paper activity. Okay, so what is active learning? Active learning is instruction that focuses the responsibility of the learning on the learners. So rather than simply telling students what to learn and how to learn it, it means getting them to engage with the material and to learn through that engagement. We tend to think of active learning as being physically active as opposed to being physically passive. So getting up out of the seat and doing activities rather than sitting there and listening to a lecture. But it's really more so about being mentally active and not mentally passive. So active learning involves things such as answering questions and solving problems, talking, reflecting, writing, and it can even include activities such as reading, so long as students choose what to read or read while searching for specific information of interest or while thinking of questions or themes that the reading raises. And active learning can even also involve listening, so long as students are incorporating what they hear with what they already know and are thinking about the meaning of what is being said, asking whether or not it makes sense, or trying to understand the perspective of the speaker. So it doesn't really matter what it is that you are doing with your students. What matters is that they are actively engaged in the process. So in the standard mode of instruction, instructors do much of the talking and students passively listen. Or students are actively doing something else, such as texting on their phone or daydreaming about something else. This is pretty much the opposite of active learning. Lecturing has gotten a pretty bad rap because 90% of the time it's a very passive form of learning. However, active learning does not necessarily mean abandoning the lecture format. To incorporate more active learning in a lecture, first and foremost, don't even lecture for more than 15 minutes at a time. Change it up, switch activities, do something different. Try and get students to apply what they just learned, and then return to lecturing if that's what is needed. Give students a few minutes to work with the information you just gave them. It can often be difficult for students to actually think about what you are telling them when they are really busy writing down every word you say because they might be tested on it. I know I have a hard time really processing, really considering what a lecturer is saying when I don't have those brief moments to reflect on it. A great cue as to whether or not your students are having enough of an opportunity to really think about what you are saying is whether or not they're asking questions. If there are no questions coming from your students, it's probably because they don't even know what those questions are yet. If you find this happening, pause for a moment and have students work out a problem with a neighbor or give them a moment to individually think of an example of the topic at hand. And make it a point to ask your students questions during your lecture. Don't just ask, does that make sense? Or are there any questions? Ask specific questions that let you know whether or not your students get it and are following along. Give them a chance to check in with themselves as to whether or not they can answer your questions. have students take a moment to summarize the most important concepts from your lecture in writing. By the process of articulating what you have just explained, it will become clear both to you and to the students what holes they still have in their understanding. You can also have students compare notes with a partner. I know a really effective instructor that when she suspects that students are confused, but no one is saying anything or asking any questions, she pauses for a moment and asks them to turn to a partner and see if they can identify any questions they might have. She says that often just after a minute of turning to a partner, students suddenly have questions for her. Okay, so very often experts argue that the problem with the lecture format is that students just don't have a very long attention span. They simply cannot pay attention to a long-winded lecture. You've probably heard that the typical attention span of a student is somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. So what do you think? Does that sound about right? Would you guess longer, shorter? In fact, one study looked at just that. Well, a number of studies have looked into the attention span of students, but this study actually asked students to report the moment in which they realized they had just experienced a lapse of attention. They gave students in 3 different chemistry classes clickers and asked them to press a button on the clickers each time they realized their minds had wandered. The data in this graph are a little difficult to interpret, but the shaded columns represent spikes in the number of attention lapses. And you can see that attention lapses were occurring as early as 30 seconds into the lecture. Now, the researchers concluded that these very early lapses of attention likely represent a settling in period, but then they noticed the next spike in attention lapses occurred between 4.5 and 5.5 minutes into the lecture, and again between 7 and 8 minutes, and then again between 9 and 10 minutes, and so on. So much earlier than the 10 to 15 minute window that is often referenced. However, they also noticed that spikes in attention lapses occurred more frequently the longer a lecture carried on, to the point where they were occurring every 2 minutes by the end of the lecture. What this means is that the length of the lecture does matter. The longer it carries on, the more frequent the lapses in attention. And not surprising, the researchers found that there were fewer lapses of attention during active learning portions of the class. These active learning portions included using clickers to respond to questions. Students, of course, use different clickers to answer questions than to report their lapses of attention, and also demonstrations in class. Very interesting, however, is that they found fewer attention lapses during the lecture that followed active learning. So what this means is that active learning really serves a dual purpose. One is to provide learning situations in which attention lapses are less frequent, but active learning also serves to decrease the number of lapses in attention during lecture. Now, if that isn't cool, then I don't know what is.